and he will tell us about the Relaxion with particle production.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. Very happy to be back at Davis. This time it's a much shorter commute. So I'll be telling you about something that I've been thinking about with Anson, who's also at Stanford, for the past couple months, and we think now we have a solid story of how to implement a new type of Relaxion using particle production. Anyway, I will warn you that still something that we're working on. We're optimistically hoping that we'll finish it next month, but it's hard to judge. And so there are a couple things that still need to be ironed out, and so hopefully that won't influence the quality of the talk very much. But I think it's a cool idea and want to share with you. Why we're interested in that? Well, because one of the main questions that I think most of us want to understand is, why is the Higgs mass small? It's the only operator in the standard model, apart from the cosmological constant, that is not protected by any symmetry. The only renormalizable operator. So our intuition is that it should be as high as any other UV physics that we have in the standard model. And nonetheless, it seems to be relatively light. And over the years, that has made us, inspired us to think about many different ways of do model building, mostly trying to implement a symmetry that protects the Higgs mass. So the idea is that, if you just look at the Higgs mass as it is, we know that it's not being protected by anything, and so it will pick up any UV physics. Its mass will get contributions from any UV physics that you might have. But if you actually have some symmetry that's being restored at some larger scale, once you reach that scale, that contribution of the UV physics will be saturated, and then it'll end, because it will notice that, there's really a symmetry that's not allowing this operator to be generated. And so you'll only get a contribution that's proportional to that the scale at which the symmetry is restored. And that's the story for supersymmetry, for composite Higgs, and which I think are the main ways that we figured out how to protect the Higgs mass. And that would be probably everyone's preferred way of protecting the Higgs mass, but unfortunately it requires us seeing a little bit more structure than we are currently seeing, and that motivates us thinking a little bit outside the box. Another possible solution is to think that there is a landscape. It's not particularly, in my opinion, it's not something that I'm particularly excited about, because there's not much that you can say about it. It's very, it's not clear that you will ever be sure that this is the case. It's not clear that what you would learn from that. But it's a possibility that our universe just has many, many vacua in our UV theory. In this different vacua, the Higgs mass could have different values. And very few, parametrically, a small number of those vacua would have a light Higgs. But if the universe populates all sorts of different patches of the universe populate this different vacua, we would only find ourselves in ones in which life is possible, and then maybe that's why we're living in such a special place. But this is very hard to make precise, and so it's not something that I'll pursue here. But last year, Peter, David, and Surjit actually came out with another idea, which is it is a multiverse landscape in nature. It is another solution in which you do have multiple vacua, in which the Higgs mass has different values. But instead of postulating that the universe is some distribution of those vacua, and you see yourself in the special one because that's the only way the only place where you could exist, there's actually there's a dynamical reason for why most patches of the universe are attracted to that small Higgs vacua. And so you assume that some general initial conditions that are not particularly tuned will always lead the universe to fall into one of those vacua in which the Higgs mass is small. in their sort of simplest implementation, which is, I guess, captures most of the important physics, they just assume that maybe the way that you can probe all these different vacua is that maybe the axion, which has the axion could be scanning these different vacua. In what sense? Well, you could assume that the QCD axion instead has not only its QCD potential, but maybe there is also something that breaks explicitly the shift symmetry of the axion, and through this breaking, it can contribute to the Higgs mass. So you assume that in your UV theory, there is a very large Higgs mass in general, but depending on the VAV of your axion, that Higgs mass can change. And so if you have a very, very large axion VAV, you can actually obtain a small Higgs mass. And if you assume that in the early universe you started out in the phase in which the Higgs mass was large and positive, and that there is a potential for the axion which will move along the ways that you want, in which will make the axion slow roll in a direction that will increasingly decrease the Higgs mass, you can see that at some point the Higgs will get a VAV, and through this VAV the axion will start to feel the cosine potential, and the larger the VAV, the larger the barriers of this cosine potential. So eventually the barriers will grow large enough that they will overcome this initial potential that you're rolling with, and you'll just stop in a place. And because 0 was a very special value in which you turn on and off this cosine potential, this makes the fact that the Higgs mass is parametrically closer to 0 than your cutoff not such a big surprise. And you can actually get 100 GeV as being a special scale by saying that, wow, there's some typical slope for this potential, which, because we'll require large field excursions that are above the cutoff, the typical value of the potential will be roughly given by just this linear term. So throughout the talk, I'll always be approximating the potential as linear, but it's really in the back of my mind I have some general potential, but for the typical values of this scanner field, the slope will be parametrically given by this effective linear potential. Because, well, yeah, it's just the fact that we are far from the minimum, so I'll do a linear approximation. It's all it is. And then you can get 100 GeV by balancing these two very different combinations of scales. One, which is given by the Relaxion potential from this symmetry breaking potential, and the other one that's given by the QCD scale. So you're balancing very different size scales, and you're getting 100 GeV, but I would claim this is not fine-tuning, because if I do a small change in any of the parameters, that will lead to just a small change in sort of the late times Higgs VAV. So let's say scales are being tuned against each other, but not finely tuned. And for their mechanism to work, and I think for most of the follow-ups to their paper and the follow-up ideas, there are typically two important ingredients. One is that you need some form of dissipation, and that's clear from the fact that if you start out the potential higher up in the slope, and you're not losing energy to anything, you're just going to zoom through all of this vacuum, and you're not going to settle in any of that. So you need some way, some mechanism that's taking energy out of your scanner field. And you need some sort of stopping mechanism that for them was the rise of this barrier. So they were rolling down, they were losing energy, but they needed to know that 100 GeV was important, and they got it through the fact that this barriers start to rise, and eventually they rise larger than the linear slope. So that's they're sort of stopping your selection mechanism. And both of those lead to some of the most problematic parts of the Relaxion. Well, apart from the fact that some people that the Relaxion is really exploring technical naturalness, but not sort of true naturalness. Sometimes you're happy to put in very small parameters as long as they're technically natural. and not everyone agrees that this is a nice thing to do, but at least you postpone the question of why are those parameters not crazy to the UV, and we already have that with the UCALs, for example. So maybe we shouldn't feel very bad about this. But in particular, some of the things that are not that great about especially with just using the QCD axiom, is that, well, the QCD axiom will no longer solve the strong CP problem, and you need to come up with a different solution to the strong CP problem that doesn't mess up with the fact that the axiom still fills a QCD barrier. And that has been solved by various ways, even in their original paper, by postulating some different type of dynamics that looks like QCD but slightly different. And another thing that is not that's somewhat troublesome is that their dissipation mechanism is just the universe it's just Hubble, so it's just the fact that the universe is expanding and so energy is diluted. And that's not a very efficient dissipation mechanism, so it forces them to scan very slowly because they can't, otherwise they wouldn't dissipate fast enough. And that typically leads to, if you want large cutoffs, to superplanckian field excursions, which different people have different feelings, but this is definitely, there are potential problems in having superplanckian field excursions, and they typically require a parametrically large number of defoldings, typically exponentially larger than 1. So what I'll tell you today is that we think we've come up with a way to use particle production as for basically doing both of these jobs. So we're going to use it both as a selection or stopping mechanism for our scanner field, and and that might be not as surprising that we can also use it as a way to dissipate energy from our scanner field. And the idea will just be that at some point our scanner field will just be, once the Higgs becomes sufficiently light, the scanner field will be able to just produce particles very efficiently, and therefore will just throw its kinetic energy into these other particles. And keeping that under control is a little bit complicated, but we think we have a nice story that works, and that everything is under control. So here is just an outline of the talk. First, I'll just discuss how does this mechanism work in a simplified setup in which I'll ignore the universe expansion. I'll not put in the standard model, but a slightly simplified theory that captures everything that I want. And hopefully, and then please stop me if you don't understand the basic mechanism, because everything else will just be complications over this that are required because the standard model is not as nice as the toy theory that we start with. And then I'll talk about how to implement it in the standard model, and say how the scanning would work if it happens during inflation, and also argue that it can also work even after inflation, as long as you have not reheated the standard model. But so it doesn't really, because we're not making use of Hubble expansion as a friction mechanism, we can actually have a decaying Hubble, and that's not a problem for us. So this I think is particularly. It's a nice addition to that we didn't expect, but we got for free. So here is, so this is our toy model. So we'll assume, instead of having some SU2 cross U1 for electroweak, I'll just do a U1. It captures all the physics, and it will actually, we'll see that U1 is much better than non-abelian gauge groups for what I'm about to say. And so there will be some abelian Higgs, some very light field, which has its shift symmetry is being broken by this Spurion epsilon. And so, because we want to keep technical naturalness, we would write all terms that are involved in symmetry breaking field, but it's really a potential of epsilon times phi. So subsequent terms are all suppressed by higher powers of epsilon, but because we'll take phi to have very large VAVs, all those terms will be roughly of the same size, and all that will matter is this combination epsilon lambda squared that will be the typical size of this load. The different terms will change the order one number, but won't change qualitatively what's happening. And this light field also has some sort of shift symmetric potential, which is coming from some other strong dynamics that in our case is completely independent of the Higgs. And so it has a fixed sized height barrier. This barrier height will not care about the Higgs. And so we can take it to be large from the beginning or relatively small, but it always needs to be chosen such that the minima actually exists. So we don't want to completely overcome it with the linear slope. And well, the most important term is that we need to put in a coupling that will allow for fast particle production. It turns out to be this coupling to the FF dual of a gauge field. And the fact that this type of coupling can lead to very fast particle production had been used before, but I was not aware of it. And it's relatively easy to understand why this coupling leads to very fast particle production.
At this point, is there any reason why phi has to be pseudo-scalar rather than scalar?
So, because this coupling is actually more efficient at producing for this particle production mechanism than just f squared. So being a pseudo-scalar is better.
So you're going to explain that, I guess.
Yeah, so here we're being a little cavalier because we really assume that phi is a... So in principle you could have the phi f squared term, but so we could say that maybe phi doesn't have well-defined CP properties. That would be one possibility. You could just explicitly break CP. But if you want, you can also assume that this coupling here is really a very small dimensionless coupling times phi squared. And when phi takes its natural size, which will be lambda squared over epsilon, I'll show that in a different slide, then you would effectively get a linear potential. But yeah, the fact that you can write this coupling to FF dual is important. So we need it to either be CP odd or that it breaks CP explicitly.
But are you going to explain why the pseudo-scalar is much better than the
Yes,
scalar?
yes. So that's where I'm going now. So yeah, the easiest way to see that you get very, very efficient particle production through this coupling is if you look at the equation of motion for the gauge field. So let me look at the equation of motion for a massive gauge field, because I'll actually mostly be interested in the phase in which the gauge field is actually Higgs. And but let me look just at the transverse polarization of the gauge fields, because those are the ones that actually will have the interesting physics. The longitudinal actually will not be efficiently produced. And if you look at the equation of motion, well, you find what would be the typical equation of motion for the gauge field, and you have this extra coupling here, which can come with different signs depending on the helicity. So helicity plus and helicity minus have different contributions from this term. So depending on the sign of phi dot, if phi dot over f is sufficiently large, you see that this whole term here in parentheses, that is sort of an effective mass for A, becomes negative, and therefore those modes become unstable. And so once you have an unstable mode, that mode will try to be exponentially produced, and it will be exponentially produced at the expense of the energy that was stored in phi dot. So that's sort of the central thing that we'll use throughout this whole model, is really making use of this fact that if you have this coupling, and if phi dot over f is sufficiently large, and what does sufficiently large here mean? It means that it has to be bigger than the gauge boson mass.
So if you had a scalar field, that equation of motion on the previous page would change in some critical way that makes this less...
Yeah, so I think, I don't quite remember when you put in the f squared term here. I think maybe, what's the difference?
I mean, kind of something that seems to me, so the most sort of vanilla situation where I would generate an operator like that is if I was integrating out some heavy physics at the scale f, right?
Yes.
And so then I would generate that operator and an infinite number of other operators.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you look at the condition for your magic to happen, right,
Mm-hmm.
then K, the momentum of the gauge field in phi dot, which is again something, K and phi dot are quantities and somehow in the low energy effective theory.
Yes.
So in the most generic case, those would never be of order, those would be suppressed compared to something like MA. I'm saying in the very most generic case. If you, on the other hand, I'm sure there are plenty of other higher dimension operators that would have the property that if you allowed the, the IR dynamical scales to be of order, the UV dynamical scale, you could get similar effects. Because basically this operator, when that term is important, this higher dimension operator is as important as lower dimension operators, right?
Yes,
that's
so
sort of
for me, the
my
question,
why the
yeah.
pseudo-scalar is so, you
Yeah,
said
so-
the pseudo-scalar was special somehow.
right, so you must be having some, so that's what I'm sort of looking for, is do you have some different interpretation of this, not just as F as being some generic UV scale? Is there some reason why it's okay for you to take these scales of order F?
So we will not need anything, neither K nor phi dot should be of order F.
Even though it's small,
It will be small, but so if M was the cutoff scale, then I agree, then we would really need
No, but
those
even-
terms to be above cutoff. But if I turn, for example, M to 0, then you would always have the very low frequency modes of A would become unstable. But if I just completely ignore M,
I see.
and
So
I take
somehow,
K's
I
of,
see.
yeah.
So if MA is much smaller, if I sort of think of K and phi dot as being one IR scale, as long as MA is parametrically smaller, this can still.
Yeah, this can,
happen.
yeah. So yeah, the important production will be for K's that are also of order phi dot over F. But this will, because if K is too large, then this term wins. So it
Now,
needs
of
to
course,
be,
generically speaking, MA is sourced by the Higgs web, right? In other words,
yeah. So that's the game we're going to play. Exactly.
So at first, there is no MA, I guess.
So for us, it will be exactly the opposite. So we'll assume that we're starting in the opposite direction than from what sort of Peter and Surjit and most other people are assuming. We'll assume that in the initial conditions of the universe, the Higgs mass was large and positive. So that you start out in this gate symmetric phase. No, sorry, large and negative. You start out with the broken symmetry because you have no temperature and your bare mass is large and negative. And then as you scan down, this VEV is decreasing and decreasing, and eventually decreases enough that this mechanism can turn on. Because when the VEV is when the VEV is large, then I agree that you would need to access modes that are outside our effective theory to actually have something that makes sense.
We still don't know why pseudo-scalar versus scalar, so if you think of the answer,
Yeah, I think.
let me know, but just proceed for now.
Yeah. I think somehow either. Yeah. I'll try to remember later. I think maybe it couples the different. It might couple A plus to A minus instead of couple A plus to A plus, and then effectively it never leads to. Like because. In principle, this term could couple, because this has this epsilon contraction, it could have coupled the equation of motion of A plus to A minus. And I think that's what would have happened if I had, didn't have the tilde here, but had the normal F.
Mhm.
But I don't quite remember if that's really the case. I'm almost sure it is.
Okay.
And yeah, so then once MA becomes small enough, smaller compared to this phi dot over F, I can start to, if I think about A as a classical field, it would start to grow exponentially, and quantum mechanically it means that you're exponentially producing quanta of that field. Just becomes, because it just went unstable, and so you're just, it just sucks out energy from the system, because they prefer to go into this unstable mode. So, here's just what I think I've already said in words, but if you imagine that you start out with this model, in which you start out with a very large Higgs VEV, and you start out with a phi that has a kinetic term that's larger than the barriers, then because if it's sufficiently larger than the barriers, then it will just fly through the barriers and basically ignore them. But the barriers are just doing some minor change in phi's trajectory, but it's just going down this linear slope. Because the linear slope is also not very big, phi is not changing very much, so we can assume that phi dot is roughly constant. it's changing, but only through this very shallow potential that here I had to exaggerate for us to see that it's actually, there is a slope. And yeah, that's what I said, very large and negative Higgs mass, and so the mass of the gauge field is about the cutoff. But because it's scanning and we're assuming it's going in the direction that's decreasing increasing, I guess, since it was negative, increasing the Higgs mass, it's decreasing the VAV, and eventually the VAV becomes parametrically lighter than the cutoff. At that point, phi dot over F can become larger than Higgs VAV, and by choosing parameters such that we ensure that once this happens, phi dot over F is roughly of order 100 GeV, this will select 100 GeV as a special point in parameter space. Similar to how the combination of epsilon lambda squared over the QCD scale selected 100 GeV for the original Relaxion. So ensuring that our dynamics is sort of robustly gives us that we can keep phi dot roughly constant up until phi dot over F reaches 100 GeV, allows us to say that we have now a stopping or selection mechanism. That's partially true. The main problem we've encountered with trying to use particle production to do anything is that, well, once you efficiently produce particles, you have a thermal state, so you have a mass. It's no longer what we were, your starting point is, you can assume, I think, without tuning that it has low temperatures, but once you start dumping order 1 fraction of the scanner energy into gauge fields, which is what you need if you want to make it stop, you will have now a very, very hot bath. And the bath is basically given by the temperature of the bath is parametrically given by what was the kinetic energy of the scanner field at the time it started producing particles. Two special things happen at this point. Well, first, if this, because this has happened when the Higgs bare mass was already smallish, it was in the hundreds of GeV region, and you're dumping a lot more energy than 100 GeV into the bath, that restores gauge symmetry. So now you're in a thermal state, and that effectively restores the gauge symmetry. And that's actually a good thing, because otherwise you would keep trying to do phi dot over F being very close to the Higgs VAV. Because if you try to drop below that, the particle production would shut off, and then you would have to wait a little bit, and so it would have this, it wouldn't be very efficiently stopping. So this part is great, but there are other plasma effects that are not just symmetry restoration, and in particular, we know that in a plasma there is Debye screening, so there is a type of effective mass for the gauge fields, and that mass is roughly given by the temperature. And as I said, because the temperature is much larger than the Higgs VAV in our universe, that could potentially spoil the whole mechanism.
Why is MA 0 rather than just the normal sort of value once the Higgs requires the normal VAV?
Oh no, so it would be 0 in a 0 temperature environment, but now if you have a temperature that's much larger than the bare mass.
No, I'm just talking about just the normal thing. I mean, if the Higgs has a VAV,
yeah, the
it
Higgs
still does, even as when it stops, right?
Sorry, maybe I was a little too quick. So what I'm saying is that once you reach this region of a few hundreds of GeV, we'll say that this mechanism turns on, and it will start to produce very efficiently this gauge field, which at this point is still massive. But if you just look at time scales, well, you're dumping a lot of energy into gauge fields, and at a very, very fast time scale, this gauge field will just thermalize with any kind of state that it can talk to. So in the case, if we're doing the full standard model, we just basically temporarily reheat the whole standard model to a temperature that is roughly given by the phi dot at which this process started. This temperature will be much larger than the Higgs VAV at that point. So it will just restore electroweak symmetry because of finite temperature effects.
So phi dot here is just an initial condition for your story, right?
Yeah, I'll show later that can be, that there, much later I'll show that there's a scenario in which there is an attractor that phi dot will just try to follow an attractor solution.
So that was my question, is whether phi dot could be just the attractor value for the potential.
Yeah,
It can be.
It can be,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
During inflation. After inflation, then no, then phi
Yeah.
dot is continuously increasing. But
Okay.
I'll show that
Okay.
if the barriers are, yeah, there's some condition on the height of the barriers versus the period that if it's satisfied, then you can find an attractor solution that basically just average over the bumps and just basically follow the linear slope. So, yeah, so this part is great because now there's in principle, no more gap, except that, well, for a long time we were very worried that maybe the Debye mass would reintroduce the gap. And at least at the level of mathematics, we understand now that it doesn't. And the fact is that, well, we can look at what is the gauge field equation of motion in the presence of a thermal background. And the thermal background is effectively parameterized by just putting in a finite temperature polarization tensor in the equation of motion for the gauge field. And this polarization tensor is just it's a function of independently of the frequency and the momentum. So finite temperature explicitly breaks Lorentz invariance, and so you do have something that is effectively not Lorentz invariant. We want to see if an unstable solution still exists, and the unstable solution means that it would be an imaginary frequency, and we'll check after the fact, but the interesting regime will be when that frequency is much smaller than the typical momentum of the modes that go unstable, and the typical momentum will be much smaller than the Debye mass because, well, the Debye mass is just the temperature, which is this very large quantity. And in that regime, this function, this side here, can be approximated by just this expression. So it depends. So the reason why it doesn't really look like a mass is because it actually has this omega over k dependence. So it's not just a constant. And so now we can actually try to solve this equation, and we find that there are unstable modes, but they are largely diluted by temperature effect. So now you're paying a 1 over t squared price, and t is a very large energy.
So does this have anything to do, I seem to remember, maybe this was just for a non-abelian plasma or something? I thought that there's a big difference between magnetic and electric modes at finite temperature.
There's
The electric-
both, yeah.
Electric modes, you see the screening just sort of at a very simple approximation. It's a lot harder to understand the magnetic screening.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
has nothing to do with this, because you're not making any distinction.
It sort of does. I was about to get to this point.
Okay, so.
Yeah. So I mean, when we were worried about this finite temperature effect, our only hope was that we knew that we generate an electric mass, but that we know that at least for E&M, magnetic fields are not screened in plasma proof. I think there's both a mathematical proof of this fact and also just experimental proof. And so we try to understand, but I don't think we understand fully the physics why this mode is not gapped. Because, for example, you can still see that if you look at a E&M plasma and you try to create electromagnetic waves in it, the electromagnetic waves are gapped. So I think what's really happening is that, and the reason why they're gapped is that because electromagnetic waves require both electric and magnetic fields, and electric fields are screened. So you try to propagate, and the electric fields hold you back in some sense. So you need to be above that frequency. But if you just try to apply a static magnetic field, that's fine because you don't need any electric field for that. So our interpretation of what's really happening is that, well, this mode goes unstable. It's trying to produce electromagnetic waves. It takes energy out of the phi dot and it just dumps into the plasma. It doesn't really produce electromagnetic waves, but just directly the plasma acts as a sink for this energy. And this M Debye can be seen as if this was happening sort of off shell. But this is all at the very, I wave my hands level. We don't really have a good understanding, except that if you just do the calculation, that's what you get. as Marcus said, the non-abelian case actually is very different. For non-abelian gauge fields, there are very strong evidence / belief that both electric and magnetic fields are screened. I think this goes back to the 80s when Linde realized that if they were not screened, then perturbation theory, even at very very soft modes, give you large divergences, and if you don't have a way to have an effective IR cutoff for these very long modes, you just have no description of your system. So he postulated that it means that non-perturbative there should be a magnetic mass. Unfortunately, non-perturbative only means that the mass is down by an extra factor of g, which for us is not a large suppression. So, and if you get a magnetic mass, I think in terms of this previous equation here would mean that this F here, the leading piece at small frequencies is not proportional to the frequency, but it would actually be a constant. And that would really gap the theory, because then you would really have something that acts like a mass. So our mechanism, as far as we understand, can only work for U1 system. It cannot work for
So
non-abelian.
does that mean we have to have an extra gauge field from the standard model ones, or?
So that if we didn't want to explain our Higgs, that would be the case. But because, I'll just show that forces us to do something that is not that. I think it's the ugliest part of our work, and I'm about to get to it. How we're going to deal with this. So before I do that, let's just give you a quick summary of how the mechanism works before I actually try to implement it in the standard model. So we have something that looks a lot like the original Relaxion story. The difference is that we actually want to start out in the early universe with a very large negative Higgs mass, such that you start out deeply in the Higgs phase with a very, very large VAV. Our cosine potential is coming from some unspecified UV dynamics that can be completely decoupled from the standard model, and the height of the barrier is independent of the Higgs. So it's just something else that you can put in at some other scale, and you see that there are some constraints on what the size of this barrier has to be, but in principle it can be completely independent of, electroweak symmetry breaking. That's the main message. And we need this coupling to FF dual of a U1 gauge field, which is the thing that's actually going to create both the friction and the selection mechanism. All our results depend on the existence of this unstable mode, which at finite temperature has a time scale, an inverse time scale that's given by this energy phi dot over F. But once you have finite temperature effects, this effect actually gets diluted, and it's this phi dot over F cubed over T squared. And typically for us, T squared will be much larger than phi dot over F. So it's really a large dilution. And we're paying, unfortunately, a large price for this. But that's the hand we were dealt. So, okay, so, yeah, sorry. Just stop here. Are there any other questions about how the mechanism works? Okay, so now that the mechanism hopefully is clear, let me tell you.
Sorry, can we just, so just in the basic, even in the toy universe, then the rest of the story is that once you're in this high temperature phase, you just cool down and you continue to be stuck in that thing. So that could just be the radiation dominated phase of our universe.
Yeah, in principle you could maybe say that that's. So we haven't tried it very much, but in principle we could even say maybe that's how you reheated the universe. But there's some
you just match, there's no more issue.
There's no more issue
matching onto cosmology.
Yeah.
Cosmology.
I mean, there's some small constraint that you probably don't want to thermalize the sector that's generating this potential. I mean, in principle you can, as long as temperature is diluting fast, but so that you don't move very far after you've done this. But the safest thing would be to not, to not thermalize this other sector. But this other sector can be talking very weakly to us just through the Relaxion, and so that's a fairly easy constraint to satisfy. especially because we're not specifying what the sector is. But I mean, we've made some toy models in our head just to convince ourselves that really one could always claim that you have to go through this f prime, and this f prime can be in principle larger than this f. And by making f prime large, we can always make sure that we are not effectively producing the other sector. So yeah, well, the story for the standard model will be very, very similar to the toy example I had, except that now our Higgs is the SU2 cross U1 Higgs. The relaxation will still be the same. The additional strong dynamics will still be the same, unspecified. And because we've seen that we need to actually talk to U1 gauge field, we'll couple the phi to hypercharge. And in principle, this looks great, except that, well, nothing's as easy as it seems when you're trying to make something new. And unfortunately, we lost our selection mechanism. And the reason is that even if the Higgs has an enormous VAV, this FF tilde here will still have a massive and a massless component, and we'll always be able to access the massless component, which is the photon. So there's no way that we're gapping the unstable mode. And so it would mean that whenever phi dot started being non-zero, this mechanism would start and we would get stuck immediately in the beginning.
That the term phi coupled to hypercharge whatever generating term can generate potential for your phi, which is for
So no, because this term, that's the other reason why FF tilde is better than F squared, is that this term actually respects the shift symmetry. So it would only generate potential for derivatives of phi. I mean, this is really, yeah, this is a coupling that's allowed for a real for an actual lodestone. It's a real shift symmetric coupling.
So you have gauge symmetry breaking from the very beginning, like a hypercharge.
Yeah, we'll have and we'll see that we'll need even more symmetry breaking. So we'll assume that inflation started with in our cache, electroweak symmetry was completely broken.
Okay.
Yes.
And I know that, have you looked at, you could imagine lots of, in the Relaxion story, the phi FF dual description operator is really, really special because on the one hand, it's shift symmetric, so it's natural for it to be somehow big, and yet it contributes to the potential. These things sound like they just contradict each other, but they don't for that one very special term. But for your story, it seems like it's in principle possible that some other term that had just explicitly a derivative on phi, so then it's shift symmetric. But then when your phi dot gets big, that term modifies things and gives some sort of instability to particle production, like the kind you're talking about. Maybe it doesn't even involve gauge fields, maybe it involves fermion fields or something like that. Have you looked at that, or is there really something special about phi, this particular term?
So, I mean, we tried, I can tell you roughly our bumpy ride for getting to this. We first tried coupling to fermion. So, for example, you could say that you're coupling to some sort of fermion number current of some fermion that becomes light when the Higgs is light, and so you can now produce these fermions very fast. There, you get extremely penalized by the fact that you very rapidly reach Fermi blocking. And so you can't really dump all that much energy into the fermions. Coupling to a scalar doesn't work because, well, then we would have to explain why the other scalar was light. Well, it would always be light, or it would not be natural.
So the only problem is Fermi blocking.
The only problem was Fermi blocking. Okay. But our first attempt was to do it with fermions.
Okay.
Coupling through some. Well, our first attempt was to do something that was not shift symmetric, but then then it was not good. So this is the problem that I've already stated. Unfortunately, the standard model was not the perfect candidate for this to happen. So nonetheless, we really want this to work, so we found a way around it. I would be very happy to hear of another way around it, because this, I think, is the lowest point of my talk. So we are going to postulate that there's another, well, more than postulate, we're going to construct a reason for why SU2, not SU2 cross U1, but the SU2 part is also completely broken in the early universe by some other dynamics. And then we'll say, and then we'll just ensure that this dynamics can be such that at late times, SU2 is restored, and as long as, well, this is still natural, and that this change from SU2 being broken at some high scale in the early universe versus being unbroken in the late universe does not change the Higgs mass by more than 100 GeV. So as long as we satisfy all of this, we'll declare success. And it's possible to, I'll show you that one way in which it's possible to do it. And it's by reviving Technicolor.
You came to the right place.
Yeah, I debated for a long time if I wanted to make the joke of making Technicolor great again, but I'm not sure how great this is, so probably not. I'll save this joke for later. So, with another Higgs for SU2 wouldn't work because it would, well, the only natural VAV for the other Higgs would be the cutoff scale. And so you would be changing the VAV of SU2 from 0 to the cutoff scale, and you would always generate, for example, mixed quartics between that other Higgs and our Higgs, and that would change the cutoff, the bare mass of our Higgs by cutoff times that quartic coupling. That quartic coupling is not small because it's also generated by gauge loops. So there was. With just a Higgs, there's no way to do it. But with Technicolor, you have enough protection that you can actually do it. And, well, just assume that SU2 talks not only to the standard model, but also to some other confining gauge theory, which has chiral representations of SU2. And if SUN, if the n here is an odd number, then we need to put 2 of those to avoid double everything I'm saying to avoid the Witten anomaly. But apart from that, everything is okay. And when this SUN confines, and we'll assume it confines, its confinement scale is sufficiently above the TV scale, it breaks SU2 because it has this chiral quarks, which are in principle massless. And because of that, when we set the Higgs VAV to 0, well, when we turn on a non-zero Higgs mass, it's only really giving a mass to the hypercharge. And so as we set the Higgs mass to, as we dial the Higgs VAV to 0, the hypercharge is the thing that's becoming light, those other guys are still heavy. This is the setup we want. And you might ask, so, but how do I turn off Technicolor? Well, you Higgs it. You just assume that then there is some other Higgs that's charged under this SUN. Let's say it's a bifundamental of this SUN, for example. And so it allows me to write down the following mass term for my quarks. And so once sigma gets a large VAV, these quarks become very massive. If their mass is above the confinement scale of SUN, now the remaining SUN, let's say, is broken to some SU with smaller n or some SO. It doesn't really matter, but if the quarks that were making it break SU2 are no longer in the spectrum, this will no longer break SU2. So as long as this mass here is larger than this cutoff scale, SU2 will no longer be broken once this has been Higgs. And an easy way to have this changing behavior between having something that was not Higgs in the early universe and was Higgs in the late universe, just that, let's say that there's an extra relaxation for this guy. We don't need to work that hard for this extra guy because we don't really need to select a small mass for it. Just say that the early universe, it had a very large field value, which was ensuring that the mass of this sigma was positive, and then it rolls down to it. This relaxation just rolls down to its minimum, which say it's just a single minimum, but it just started out far away. And once it gets to 0, actually this thing has a negative mass of order of the cutoff.
So roughly, I mean, what is the mass? You know, when all the dust settles and you have your your best version of this, what is a typical value for the mass of this signal?
Yeah, so the signal will, I'll assume it's the cutoff, and
Yeah,
I can
so
have
I'm
it-
asking what is that number?
So it will be, so in the
That's
very
what I was
best
asking.
possible case scenario in which we don't have superplanckian field excursions, but allow for large amounts of inflation, it will be about 10 to the 6 but GeV. I don't like that very much because it doesn't solve the large amounts of inflation. If you solve that, it's 10 to the 5, which is
Okay.
what we can do.
So,
That's-
yeah, so but conceptually, you're just, like you answered my other question, you're just thinking of this as being ordered to cutoff, so
Yeah.
you're not explaining the VEV, the small VEV of this.
Yeah, it's just let it be big. I don't care. I just need to make sure in the early universe it was not Higgs. That's the only thing I
There's a
need.
time dependence.
Yeah, so as long as the time scale for this thing to relax to its minimum is slow compared to my scanning mechanism, I'm okay. And that's easy to engineer in a technically natural way. Nonetheless, although I don't think this sector is particularly nice, there is one nice prediction, which is, well, it still leads to a change in the Higgs mass, it's just suppressed by a large loop factor. And you can estimate that the change in the Higgs mass is roughly given by alpha squared. Really, the mass of this fermion is the upper bound. So it's really the mass. It's both, but because the mass of fermion is large in Technicolor scale, there are sort of two bounds. Both alpha squared times the mass of that fermion and alpha squared times the Technicolor scale over 16 pi squared has to be smaller than v squared. So this thing is sort of below 30, 40 TeV. So you would need to have new states that are not parametrically far from us. If this is the only way we can get around our issue, which we still have hopes that that's not the only way.
So this is not, why is there no, there was a Higgs coupling to these Technicolor things, but it doesn't appear as a parameter here, so it was fixed by something?
So, I mean, you can say that it's technically natural for that to be very small because the Higgs will only couple through, I think, a 3-loop diagram. I mean, if you postulate, you see what's the smallest possible quartic coupling that I can put between the two, that is still technically natural. And there will be some diagram in which the Higgs talks to the SU2s, which talk to the fermions. Let's see, which talk to the fermions, which then talk to this guy. Yeah. This is.
But I don't understand, because in our universe today, is this somehow a requirement that you don't want the Higgs mass to be too large in the early universe? Because it's not broken today. So this is somehow saying that, however, earlier in the universe, when this Technicolor was breaking SU2, you still can't have this shift to be too large. Is that the statement?
No, the statement is that we did, our scanner did the tuning for us when this scalar didn't have a VEV. After this scalar develops a VEV, let's say our scanner has stopped, so now our Higgs mass is fixed for whatever value it got stuck at.
Right.
And now let's say that this scanner gets a VEV. Through this VEV, it will generate an effective change in the Higgs mass. Let's say because you had some sort of Higgs squared, sigma squared coupling. So we don't want this to spoil the thing that we've carefully arranged in the early universe.
Yeah, so my question is, why isn't lambda appearing in that estimate?
Oh,
Is
I'm
it
just
fixed by something? Or
No,
you
I'm just saying
assumed
that-
it was one?
Yeah, so this condition here is basically you can rephrase it in what is the smallest technically natural value for lambda, and it's estimated from some diagram like this.
Right.
Yeah, so in some sense, if you replace this lambda TC here by the mass of the fermion, for example, then it's hidden in the mass of the fermion. That's where the lambda is. Well, sorry. I'm saying that this lambda here will be generated by this other lambda and G2 and G1 actually. Yeah, I think actually this was really meant to be alpha 1. Sorry.
Okay,
So,
why don't you go on?
yeah.
I think that,
Okay. So, well, now let's say that we've worked very hard, and well, basically out of time. Just
My fault, I'll shut up now.
yeah, I mean, I'm now it's mostly yeah. I'm getting to the part that's more storytelling than the actual mechanism, because the mechanism is more or less settled. We'll assume that all of these conditions have been met. What are initial reasonable conditions for our parameters? That's basically all I have left now to say. What are reasonable things that our parameters need to satisfy? Well, we want the field excursions to be given by lambda squared over epsilon, because that's what allows us to actually tune the scanner versus the bare mass, which was the size of the cutoff. And if we want that to be smaller than the Planck scale, that puts a lower bound on epsilon. So epsilon can't be too small, otherwise you would be forced to have superplanckian excursions. We want the minimum of the cosine potential to actually exist, so we don't want the linear slope to overcome it. So there puts also a lower bound on our on the size of the bumps of that unspecified cosine potential. And we want the minimum to actually be scanning finely enough that we actually can see 100 GeV. If the f prime is gigantic, then one value would be then we wouldn't be scanning finely enough. We would have to be very lucky that one minimum happened to be when you had 100 GeV Higgs mass. So assuming that, all of these conditions are satisfied, then we just now need to ensure that our initial conditions allow us to self-tune to the weak scale, which is we need to ensure that phi dot reaches some sort of terminal velocity, which is more or less constant, and that phi dot over f is selecting 200 GeV as a special point. And we need to ensure that once this happens, that it will lose energy fast enough such that it will actually get stuck there and will not start radiating, but then fly over many, many bumps and end up having a very, very different Higgs mass, just because the energy loss was too inefficient, and then it took too long to lose energy, and you fall out in the minimum right over here when you've already overshot your target. And so there are two conditions of the energy loss that are important. One is that you're really over time losing energy, because, well, you're going down this linear slope, so you're gaining a little bit of energy. So you need to make sure that you're losing more energy than you're gaining. And that's relatively easy. You can estimate that the typical energy loss is going to be your typical kinetic energy over the time scale over which that unstable mode sucks energy out of your system, which is 1 over that frequency. So it's just this not particularly enlightening expression. And the energy you're gaining over time is just how far along the linear potential you're moving. So you just need to ensure that you have a net loss over time. And you have a net loss up until, and you see that the bigger your phi dot, the easier it is to have a net loss. So you need to ensure that you have a net loss all the way down to when phi dot is roughly the size of the bumps, because then you can actually get stuck. So this gives sort of another lower bound on the size of the bumps, which depends on a different combination of the parameters. And it's a not very enlightening one, but I'll show you that once other constraints are satisfied, I can actually put a conservative bound, which is much easier to see if it's reasonable or not. So just bear with me for one more slide. So, and the other thing is that, as I said, if you lose energy too slowly, then you will actually fly over too many minima, and you might end up with a Higgs mass that had nothing to do with your trigger, which was the 100 of GeV. So you need to make sure that this is not the case. That the time it takes for you to lose energy, in the time it takes you for you to lose energy, you're not moving field space more than, the effective change in the Higgs mass from that point on is smaller than your target. So that you really want delta m to be smaller than v, and you can calculate delta m by knowing that, well, delta m squared is epsilon times the change in delta, and and you can rephrase this in terms of phi dot and the typical time scale to lose energy, which is again that tachyon energy. And we see that it goes as 1 over phi dot squared, and now so t squared is related to the initial phi dot, and this phi dot here is the phi dot as a function of time. As you're losing energy, phi dot is decreasing. So we see that the largest contribution comes from right before you stop. So So it's a very IR-dominated effect. So if I plug in phi dot, the minimum phi dot that I need right before stopping, which is the size of the barrier, I get another bound on epsilon. And this is actually, this bound together with not having superplanckian field excursions is what allows us to set bounds on how large a cutoff can we take and things like that. So as promised, this bound on epsilon, which is coming from not overshooting the 100 GeV, and that bound, which is just that we are effectively losing energy. If I combine the two, I get a better bound for what is the minimum size of the barrier. Just because if I plug in the maximum allowed value for epsilon here, I get a very conservative bound on the size of my bumps, and I get that it needs to be some geometric mean of the weak scale and the cutoff. So since we'll see that lambda can be up to 10 to the 5 GeV, we see that there's room. We don't need to have the bumps being exactly V or exactly the cutoff. There's some room, so we don't feel so uncomfortable saying that there are many coincidences of scales, but we don't need to actually get them to be order one of each other. We have parametric spacing between them. So just flying through this, as I had promised, I'll just keep the after inflation, but just tell how the mechanism works during inflation. Well, during inflation, you need Hubble to be bigger than lambda squared over m Planck, because, well, you have the assumption that your field is doing lambda squared over epsilon excursions mean that its potential is actually changing by order lambda squared, the potential of the scanner. And so you don't want that to be dominating your vacuum energy. So you need something else, like the inflaton, to be dominating your vacuum energy. So you need Hubble to be bigger than what you would get just by the scanner. You also need to start out with kinetic energies larger than the bumps, otherwise you would immediately stop and there would be no interest in physics. And we'll assume that the temperature was parametrically smaller than the cutoff, such that in the early universe there was no finite temperature effect that was spoiling our effect. And you can show that during inflation, if you have the setup that we have, this linear slope with the bumps, if phi dot starts out sufficiently, and sufficiently is just a factor of few, sort of 2, 3, bigger than the bumps, and epsilon lambda squared over Hubble, which would be the slow roll velocity, if you turn off the bumps, is bigger than the bump, so that, let's say, then you can effectively assume that it will just average over the bumps and will just follow the linear potential. So just rephrase this, is just the idea that if you have kinetic energy sufficiently above the bumps and the linear slope is enough to allow you to continue going on that with that speed, even with Hubble friction, you'll just basically ignore the bumps. There will be a very small effect to the bumps, but they are just doing some small oscillatory behavior on phi dot that typically integrates out to 0. And you just follow this effective slow roll trajectory, which is clearly not a true slow roll trajectory, because the true slow roll trajectory would always make you get stuck in the minimum here. And because you have this effective slow roll, you know your velocity, which, as I said, is some sort of a tractor solution, and it's constant. And you know you need to do a field excursion of lambda squared over epsilon, so that tells you how many e-foldings of inflation you need. And it's given by this ratio of Hubble and epsilon. And we also know the temperature, which is given by this phi dot here, which is just this effective slow roll. So if I combine all of these conditions, the temperature is given by this, and that the number of e-foldings required is given by h over epsilon, with the two upper and lower bounds I had on epsilon, which are that I don't want superplanckian field excursions, and that I don't want to overshoot 100 GeV when I'm scanning, I can, massage this to the expression and get some bound on the actual cutoff of the theory based on other parameters which are independent. So it's completely determined by the Wick scale, the Planck scale, and how many e-foldings of inflation I want. It's not that sensitive to the number of e-foldings of inflation that I want, because I'm going to take a 6th square root. But in particular, if I choose, let's say, order 100 e-foldings, which is something that we are comfortable with for inflationary scenario, that tells me that the cutoff can only be raised up to 10 to the 5 GeV, which is fine. Maybe at 10 to the 5 GeV we have some sort of split SUSY or something else that's UV completing. It's sufficiently far from us that I think it's a net gain to actually have this effect if we don't see anything at the LHC. If I want to crank delta n to be as large as possible, there are actually extra bounds on h over epsilon that come from the fact that you can't have h too large, otherwise your slow roll velocity would be too small and you'd get stuck in the bump, basically. It allows us to go to 10 to the 6 GeV, and that requires, I think, 10 to the 6 or 10 to the, well, I guess I can see from here. Requires us going sort of 10 to the 6 e-foldings of inflation, which doesn't seem, I think I'd rather lower my cutoff by a factor of 10 than have exponentially large amounts of inflation. So just say that, well, even if this number here is bigger than the number of e-foldings, then I could in principle do the scanning after inflation. And the reason is that inflation is not really doing anything for us because we don't need Hubble friction. We just can't have large temperatures. So if we enter a preheating phase in which the energy density is just in the inflaton as it oscillates in its potential, so it looks like matter domination but with zero temperature, then we can finish the scanning then. But phi dot becomes very close to the cutoff in that case. So then the maximum cutoff is sort of 40 GeV. So sorry for going over time. Here are my conclusions. I hope I convince you that particle production is an interesting possibility for doing Relaxion model building. It's really qualitatively new. We don't think any other model, I mean, all the other models are much closer to the original idea by just tweaking, putting 2 fields to scan and things like that. So I think hopefully this will open up exciting possibilities and maybe a slightly more promising model than ours. It has, besides being sort of new and interesting in its own, it sort of helps solve some of the problems of that are very typical in Relaxion models, like requiring very large number of inflation, having to deal with superplanckian field excursions. It's completely decoupled from electroweak symmetry breaking because we don't need the Higgs to be raising the height of the potential, and so it won't spoil the strong CP problem or anything like that. So with that, thank you.
Any more questions for